Hello, everyone, and welcome to the International Grain Forum. Our today's session is European Biofuels 2026 Ethanol and Biodiesel Market Outlook. It is my great pleasure, honor to welcome our outstanding expert for S&P Global Energy Plus. It is Suzanna Hayek, Fuel Ethanol Price Reported. Many thanks, Susan, for being with us. And Uzma Gulbahar, Biodiesel Price Reporter. Uzma, many thanks. It is a huge pleasure and honor once again to have such a great expert with us. I would like to thank you all for joining us today. This is designed as an active discussion, so please be free to be active in the discussion. Place your comments, questions in the chat. Once again, it is my pleasure to announce that the International Grain Forum 2026 will take place on May 18 at the Novi Sad Agriculture Fair here in Serbia, and we look forward to welcome you here in person. Without further ado, I would like to ask Uzma, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Vlado. So hi everyone, thank you for joining. So I'm Uzma, the European Biodiesel Editor at Platts. So just to give a brief overview of S&P Global Energy, it's the home of pricing and news under the division of S&P Global, and we are a leading provider of price assessments across a range of commodity sectors. So more specifically, Suzanna and I are on the biofuels and feedstocks team. So across the team, we cover ethanol, sustainable aviation fuel, biodiesel, used cooking oil, renewable diesel, biobunkers, renewable tickets, and more recently, we started covering glycerin. So I cover first generation and second generation biodiesel and the waste feedstock used cooking oil. So I'll just run through a bit about what we'll be covering today. So we'll look at market fundamentals and how biodiesel is shifting following these legislative updates. We'll also cover RED III and look at a key EU member state, so Germany. And then we'll go on to recent pricing trends in the market across biodiesel and UCO. So in terms of the key trends from RED III, as we know, biofuels, it's a legislative-driven market, and this is the sort of main framework for biofuels, and it revises the 2030 targets for renewable energy adoption across the EU, so in transport, aviation, and maritime. In terms of how these targets are reached, member states have flexibility on how to actually achieve these. So this is a bit about what we're looking at. So the key things we're taking away from this legislation is that there are more ambitious long-term targets. And now also most countries in Europe are switching to GHG reduction targets instead of emissions-based. And then we also have sector-specific targets where proposals include separate targets for road, aviation, and shipping. And now a bit of a deep dive into Germany for RED III. So starting with obligated parties, so all fuel suppliers for transport are covered under this quota. But aviation and marine fuels are exempt. And then for Annex 9A, the advanced sub-target has increased to 2% in 2026. And this is up from 0.7% in 2025. So we can see a significant ramp up in advanced volumes from next year. And then for the sort of headline obligation, you can see that over the years, the GHG reduction target is rising steadily. So it will reach 59% by 2040, and that's compared to 25% by 2030 under the current law. And then in sort of one of the key things that is impacting biodiesel markets is the removal of the double counting mechanism. So from 2026, Annex 9A biofuels won't be eligible for double counting towards the GHG quota. So what this effectively means is that parties will need to secure higher physical volumes in order to meet these targets. Then we have feedstock caps. So the Annex 9B cap is set at 1.9% from 2026, and this then rises to 2% from 2031, and it gradually increases to 2.8% by 2039. And then finally, we have a ban on palm oil-based products, which will be excluded from 2027. And this includes related waste products such as POME, so palm oil malt effluent. So in terms of a short overview, in a nutshell, we're seeing higher GHG ambitions, rising advanced sub-targets, and then also the scrapping of double counting, which is sort of increasing these mandates ambitions. So these policies are expected to take effect retroactively, with approval most likely to be at the end of Q1. And then following this legislation, the sort of key things we're taking away from it is the removal of double counting for biodiesel. So we hear that that priority will go to vegetable oil biodiesel with high GHG savings, and this is expected to be high greenhouse gas savings RME. So we're expecting increasing demand for this in the coming year. So market participants say there is potential for demand on fuels that aren't currently double countings, but that have high GHG savings. And from this, we can see that crop-based biodiesel will play a huge role in this year. At the same time, we have to remember that there is a crop cap. So it is a blending game to see what will be the most efficient and economically viable biodiesel to use. And then at the same time, given these higher GHG ambitions and the removal of double counting, we also see a move to advanced biodiesel. So advanced FAME is going to play a huge role this year. And owing to that, there's, in terms of advanced feedstocks, market players are looking to different markets such as food waste oil and soapstock acid oil. So sources are saying that they will buy as much advanced feedstock as long as possible, as long as the price makes sense, in order to meet these GHG targets. And now I'll move on to some pricing trends. So we saw an interesting thing that happened on December 10th. This is when the German cabinet approved the red draft. So there were a few factors contributing to why we saw this reversal in the relationship between RME and UCOME. So we're starting seeing RME premiums trading above UCOME. So that's crop trading above waste. So the first thing is RME is a winter spec biodiesel. So it's typically in high demand in the winter period because of its low CFPP properties. So it's suitable to use in temperatures as low as minus 12 degrees. Adding to this, with the removal of double counting, we understand that RME is the most compliant and widely available option for crop-based biodiesel. And also around this time, UCOME has been under pressure, and it continues to do so, mainly due to the high feedstock prices, putting pressure on UCOME, and also a lack of demand around this time for waste-based biodiesel. So that's why we sort of saw that trend towards the end of last year. And now going on to sort of more recent pricing in the feedstock market. Around October, we saw used cooking oil demand slowing down. There was no shortage or scarcity of the product. Suppliers were aiming for higher prices, but more likely dipping their toes in to see the response. But since then, we've seen for nearly a month sort of stability in used cooking oil prices around $1,200. And this is for FOB ARA standard specs, so that's 5% FFA. We are hearing that major players in the market are covered and UKME margins remain poor. So it seems like there's not much reaction on the feedstock side compared to the product side following these red three drafts. It seems like if you're a HVO producer, you want advanced feedstock, whereas if you're a biodiesel producer, it's quite difficult to afford UCO anyway. So it just feels like there's very thin liquidity in the market at the minute. So what we're seeing is UCO demand is quite poor, and there's too much of it. There's too much supply and less demand from producers as the tanks are full. And then, in terms of recent pricing for across biodiesel, we've seen pretty much subdued demand across all categories, mainly due to low diesel consumption around this time of year, and a lot of contracts were filled at the end of last year. So we are hearing from market participants that slow demand and as well as the biodiesel blendable cap are contributing to the lack of impact in biodiesel markets. Adding to this, there seems to be more of a focus of HVO instead of biodiesel, and at the same time, of course, there's a lot of regulatory uncertainty. And then across the biomass-based diesel complex, sources have said that storage tanks have been filling and there's low demand driven mostly due to this legislative uncertainty in Germany. So what we know so far is there was a meeting last night to be held with the lower house of German's parliament, but full legislative clarity is not expected until after a second reading and vote. So that's towards the end of March. I think I'll pass it on to Suzanna now, who will give you an overview of ethanol.
Okay. Many thanks, Susan, for excellent presentation.
No
Thank you.
worries.
Thank you, Isma. Hi, everyone. As Isma mentioned, I'm Suzanna, and I cover the T2 ethanol FOB Rotterdam Northwestern European benchmark at S&P Global Energy Platts. And I'm going to talk you through the impact of legislation on current price trends and what it means for in the near future of how we might expect to see the prices and in terms of trade flows and demand and supply. So one of the major changes in policy for the ethanol fuel market is from the 1st of January, the Netherlands now only will count undenatured ethanol towards its RED obligations, whereas previously denatured ethanol imports were also counted. Now, the key difference between them is the stamp duty. Undenatured imports, the stamp duty is euro 192 per cubic meter, whereas denatured is 102 euros per cubic meters. Now, the idea behind this was to level the playing field because Germany and France, have always had undenatured imports count towards their renewable targets, and to protect producers' interests. Now, obviously, another key change that we saw last year was the US-UK trade agreement, which allowed for 1.4 billion liters of tariff-free fuel ethanol from the US to enter the UK market, which was estimated at the time to be equivalent to the entire UK domestic market. Now, as a result of that, we saw, one of the two bioethanol plants in the UK shut down, and Vivego, and the other, and Ensis is now on pause. So it's not, Ensis isn't currently producing ethanol. And both plants used to supply fuel ethanol volumes to the EU. Now, also, as Uzma mentioned, under RED III transposition, both Germany and the Netherlands will be removing or double counting incentives, which means more volumes in the market. And also the Netherlands followed in the footsteps of Germany. Germany's been an emissions-based target under RED for a very long time, and the Netherlands only as of 2026. Now, also another legislation that we saw impact the market is in the US, the producers credit to incentivize producers to produce low carbon intensity renewable fuels, the 45Z credit. There were uncertainties around guidelines whether the European EN undenatured fuel grade ethanol will benefit producers of this credit. So there were uncertainties whether it extends to European production, but as of early February, there were new guidelines proposed, which market participants reported that it might extend to undenatured European fuel grade ethanol. And also under the German RED III proposal is to have on-site audits. And NBC recently announced that from February 19th, market participants have to report if countries will allow witness audits or not. So far, Brazil, which is a key exporter to Europe, is not on the list. Neither is Guatemala. So all of these things we've seen impact the market, and how exactly. So here we could see when the Netherlands, end of September, there was the market heard of the Netherlands' proposal to go from denatured ethanol to undenatured, and then on October 2nd, it voted for it to go ahead. So we saw the reaction from the market is that there was a lot of volatility because, all of these volumes, or if players had denatured ethanol, they now needed to purchase undenatured in order to be able to meet their obligations as of 2026. And then, we saw prices in December, quite low because there were some US volumes in ARA that were still there. But obviously, now what we hear in January and February, usually during this period, there is stock build, but stocks are drawing, which is not typical for this time of year. And that's why we saw prices then be supported. Now, obviously, when the BLE, Germany's office that is responsible for NBC, when they announced that there were going to be on-site audits have to be, countries that allow on-site audits have to be marked on the system, we saw some kind of reaction in the price. And then when it actually took effect, we also saw some reaction. So all of these factors reduced US imports as well because of the previous uncertainty surrounding 45Z credit, the replacing denatured volumes with undenatured, and double counting removal meant that there was increased demand and the stock was drawing, and that's why we continued to see support in the price. Now, this is expected to continue in March. Some major producers are going to be in maintenance. We also know of another, producer who reduced capacity until May. So the expectation in March is that there's going to be tight supplies. And that's also been reflected in the paper market, where we've seen recent strength in March and April. Now, also, although the on-site audits will not be legally in Germany, will not be legally binding until RED 3 is transposed. And there's still, uncertainty whether it will take effect in 2026 or from 2027. So there's uncertainty whether Brazilian volumes will be impacted immediately. What we hear is that the expectation in Q2, Q3 is that the market is relying on Brazilian volumes. And what we hear from Brazilian producers is they want to get this issue resolved as soon as possible. So the expectation in the market, it's not that, if Brazil will be added on the list, it's a matter of when will it be added on the list. Sorry, just want to clarify that NABISI is Germany's sustainability database, which tracks, production across the value chain to prevent as a preventative fraud measure. Okay. Now, just to give a bit of context on denatured and undenatured. So in 2025, undenatured imports in Europe, undenatured imports in Europe went down by 11% compared to 2024, whereas denatured imports went up by 25% from 2024, and 56% of those volumes were from US. Were from the US, and obviously, as I mentioned, the undenatured has a higher stamp duty. So the expectation is, in order for the US to Europe arbitrage to open, it needs to factor in this higher stamp duty. And so there has been, what I heard in the market is some reluctance from the US to supply unless the prices in ARA are supported. And also when there were some uncertainties about the 45Z credit, there was an expectation that prices needed to be supported as well to compensate for those credits. So, in the future, perhaps we will continue to, if the tightness continues, and perhaps if the prices continue to go up, there is a potential for the US to Europe arbitrage to open. But also, Brazil is another contender as well. Okay, just move on. So as we can see here, the top exporters to Europe. So we've got, and this is undenatured ethanol. Now, obviously, we saw that there were a lot of volumes that came from the US for denatured, and this is undenatured. So we see that, the increases from Ukraine. Ukraine has 125,000 metric ton tariff-free quota with the European Union, and we could see here that some of the volumes from the UK declined, and that was off the back of Vivergo negotiating with the UK government on its future status as well. And Pakistan is for non-fuel purposes and not for fuel ethanol. But Pakistan also had a tariff-free agreement, which was scrapped in June last year. And here we could see the EU fuel ethanol deficit. Obviously, it's growing, and we can see that this gap is growing, and with reduced flows from the potentially reduced flows from the US because of what I mentioned previously, the denatured stamp duty, but also the US has lots of different trade agreements with different countries as well, where they can send those volumes elsewhere, and not just to the European Union. So the question is, who's going to fill in the gap in the EU? Are we going to see volumes from Ukraine? Is it going to be more volumes from Brazil, or will there be potential for NSIS in the UK to resume operation and also continue to and resume sending volumes to ARA? So a lot of question marks, but many possibilities. So future trade agreements. Now, obviously, Mercosur, is it allows for 450,000 metric tons of tariff-free non-fuel ethanol, and 250,000 metric tons at one third of the most favored nation tariff rate for fuel and other purposes, phased in over 6 years. Now, although it was agreed on and signed, but the Mercosur deal is up for legal review in the EU. However, the EU said that it could potentially provisionally apply it in March once the first Mercosur country implements it. So it could potentially implement the reduced tariffs from March, but there's still uncertainties surrounding that. Now, obviously, we've heard in the U.S. Supreme Court overturned some sweeping U.S. tariffs, and in response, Trump promised 15%. Now, so the U.S. has always used ethanol as a bargaining chip to benefit its agriculture sector. So, if the Supreme Court overturned it, will there still be concessions that countries are going to want to make with the U.S.? How is this going to play out? So we could see some changes there with regards with trade agreements, or maybe they stay the same. At the same time, the US-UK trade agreement, as I mentioned, it allows for 1.4 billion liters of tariff-free ethanol into the UK, and that's almost equivalent to the entire domestic market. But currently, the UK government is only debating, it's in the debating stages, about joining the EU customs union. Now, obviously, this is only in the debate stages. We don't know if it'll be agreed upon, even if it could take many years before this happens. But the result of this, it means the UK would have to align with any trade agreements that the EU has, and it would automatically cancel any kind of individual trade agreements that the UK has, such as the US-UK trade agreement at the moment. So I think, Uzma spoke very much, clearly about differences when it comes to RED 3 and its ambitious targets. Now, obviously, there's a shift towards GHG emissions reductions, and the crop cap remains the same. So any country's percentage of crop-based biofuels at 2020 levels plus 1%, but maximum of 7%. And compared to RED 2, we know the advanced sub-target minimum of 5.5% by 2030. So it's on the rise, but obviously this also combines renewable fuels with non-biological origins, such as hydrogen, ammonia. So, as we see, there's this constant debate with food versus fuel. So, I mean, you might already be familiar with this, but what does this mean? So this is just a brief overview of the feedstocks between a 1G and 2G ethanol. So corn, wheat, sugar beet would be considered first generation. Any kind of residues and wastes, second generation. And with removal of double counting, and as Uzma mentioned, in key countries like Germany, their advanced sub-target is at 2%. And in the Netherlands, it's about 3%, but also the Netherlands has a crop cap of 1.2%. So obviously with the RED 3 and with RED 3, individual member states can choose, what kind of targets that they want to have. So it's not uniform. They don't all have similar targets. But by 2030, they have to achieve, similar targets, basically. Okay, so, having a look at the feedstocks, European annual feedstock usage for fuel ethanol. As you can see, obviously, grains is always in the lead. And, we could see over the years, there continues to be, not a lot of feedstocks for advanced or waste material. Now, Vlado, earlier when, prior to the webinar, we mentioned the aflatoxin, in Hungary. And yeah, we saw last year that was being, used to produce some advanced ethanol, where we saw some flows come in, into Europe, but we also into the UK. But, we hear that these production of aflatoxin hit corn ethanol is going to be, perhaps reduced this year or not happening very much. So, but we do hear that, there are issues with, in some regions, the corn acreage, and so some difficulties in securing feedstocks. And that's it from me. Thank you very much. Vlado, over to you.
Okay, many thanks, Suzanne, for just excellent and insightful presentation, and many thanks for mentioning the practical issues as aflatoxin. So there is, due to the climate change drought, there is an issue in some years with a high level of aflatoxin, and having capacities for processing will be plan B, I would say, just a great option. So we do have a lot of questions which we expect, and I'll try to read it. Andrea is asking, do you see an opportunity for sunflower cultivated and intermediate crop after cereals to be used as a feedstock for SAF, advanced biofuel? What changes are needed, if any, from a regulatory perspective to make this happen?
Just speaking from the biodiesel perspective, what we know is in 2024, only 1.5% of sunflower oil has been used towards biodiesel production. And that's mainly because, it's a really expensive oil. But in terms of other veg oils, it's mainly rapeseed oil that's been used towards biodiesel. But I can get back to you regarding SAF with our SAF editor.
Okay, Usman, many thanks. And we do have another from Debonair. I am from India, and you already, I guess, tackle and answer, but could you please explain why ethanol is being imported in such large quantities?
Into Europe. Because Europe is short, so the production, total production, does not meet the consumption required, and this. And gasoline is expected to peak. Gasoline consumption is expected to peak soon, and that's why Europe is reliant on imports to fill the gap, basically. Yeah. So, but also, what we saw is obviously you have countries like the United States that can produce ethanol cheaply because they have cheaper energy costs, and the lots of corn and good margins, and so they could export, and it could be competitive with local ethanol as well, and so. Obviously, if the price is right, then it would open an arbitrage and flood the market as well. So Europe, yes, is short and requires ethanol, but also pricing dynamics, stamp duties, play a role as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Susanna, for details answer. We do have a few other questions. You already mentioned RED 3 legislation. Regarding Germany's recommended amendments to the country's RED 3 legislation, have you seen any impact in the related biofuel market?
Yes, so on January 30th, the Council issued recommendations for this legislation, which is currently being considered. So there were kind of a few points to this. One was that they wanted to accelerate the POMI ban. Another point was removing double counting incentives for volumes imported outside of Europe, but keeping double counting for volumes within Europe. And there was also a suggestion to raise the GHG target for 2027 from 16% to 17.5%. So we did kind of see firmness in the German quota market and the renewable diesel market, but the impact wasn't really felt in the biodiesel market. This was sort of last week. We saw sort of bullishness on those two markets.
It was many thanks once again. We do have a lot of questions. Joanne is asking, what do you think the future of crop-based fuel will be in Europe? On the one hand, there is a political discussion on not using primary crops for fuels, but on the other hand, there seems to be shortage of residuous waste biomass.
Yes. So, obviously it's an ongoing debate between industry and the EU government. Yes, there isn't enough feedstocks. Now, the EU also said for the marine sector and also for the aviation sector, it has to be advanced feedstocks. Now, the reality is, could it scale to supply those sectors, particularly aviation? And, potentially not really. So we don't know if, the EU will have any kind of concessions when it comes to crop-based biofuels. But we continue to see the legislation supportive of advanced feedstocks and not so much of crop-based biofuels. Although we do see in the UK, on the one hand, that they launched a consultation on crop-based feedstocks for SAF, sustainable aviation fuels, and we haven't seen something similar in the EU.
Okay, thank you. Completely agree. Thank you, Suzanne, once again. Didier is asking, I would say, about biodiesel in Europe future from the rapeseed. What is your opinion?
Yeah, so there is biodiesel made from rapeseed, so that's rapeseed methyl ester, and it typically has a cold filter plugging point of -12 degrees. So this is a winter spec biodiesel, so we typically use during the colder months.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Okay, thanks, Didier. There is in Eastern Europe and Serbia as well, the rapeseeds are producing, and as there is no many capacity for processing, usually exporting, but one of the possible ways it's the crops which is avoiding the drought. So it is going more and more. So one question, most likely from the grain sector, coming with the move to advanced feedstock. Which feedstock have been discussed in the market for advanced biodiesel?
Yeah, so what we hear is that food waste oil is cropping up quite a bit. It's more or less the same specs as used cooking oil, that's what we hear. But there is some concern that this could be sort of fraudulent product from Asia coming, so possibly just eco-labeled as food waste oil. We've also heard about soapstock acid oil as an advanced feedstock, as well as SBEO, which is spent bleaching gas oil, and sort of more integrated players are also looking at crude tall oil, so that's CTO. And another big question is POMI, of course, whether it's going to be banned from this year or next year. But we are still hearing that there is refined POMI coming from Indonesia, Malaysia, and there are still flows coming to Europe currently.
Many thanks, Suzma. It is not easy question for you. So once again, Joanne has another question. When we are looking at advanced biofuels for SAF, there seems to be open interpretation on using cover crops. Where do you see this discussion going?
I think I think it's listed clearly. When it comes to what qualifies as advanced feedstocks for SAF, I mean, it just remains to be seen exactly if we will see further clarification of what is considered cover crops. But unlike I think for the aviation, advanced feedstocks seem to be more clearly listed than for the marine sector, for instance.
Completely agree. Thanks, Suzanna. We do have for Uzma one question for you. Do you have any expectation for biodiesel demand in Q2?
Yeah, so like what we're hearing is crop is definitely back in the game. We've been hearing for Q2, Q3, the potential for RME is quite promising. We haven't seen much demand since the start of the year, but we hope to sort of see high GHG RME demand for Q2, Q3. And then for UCAME, we're hearing that margins should improve once we receive further confirmation regarding Red 3. So there should be more liquid trading activity for waste-based biodiesel too.
Excellent, absolutely agree. Thank you very much. And one more question is, how has rapeseed oil been priced recently in relation to RME?
So we assess FOB Dutch Mill rapeseed oil, and we're currently seeing front run prices at around 1,062 euros. So it's pretty firm. Rapeseed oil has increased a lot within the last month. The inverse is widening, and we have seen Matif strengthen since January. So that is really putting pressure on physical rapeseed oil. And in terms of like the relationship to RME, we hear that RME RSO margins are not that great. There are no margins on forward positions, so it is pretty thin on spot.
Many thanks once again. We do have a few questions regarding to ethanol. I believe, Susan, you already tackled this issue, but we may just pose it once again. With reduces from the US and EU in deficit, which country will fill the gap?
Yeah, as I mentioned, we will perhaps see more volumes from Brazil. Also, what I want to mention is because of the move towards high GHG savings, currently the US GHG savings is lower than Brazil. And so perhaps there will be more demand for Brazilian flows, but also perhaps coming from Guatemala or but it also depends because Guatemala does have a trade agreement now with the U.S. and they're also raising their blend wall to E10. So it depends on the dynamics there. Obviously Ukraine has a tariff-free quota with the EU, so we might be seeing volumes from there. So they're all possibilities.
Mm-hmm. So policy is big issue in those predictions. So thank you very much. There is one very interesting question. It says, what future do you see for ethanol with electrification on the rise and the phasing out of the internal combustion engines?
Yeah, so I think the European Union recently said that it would prolong the life of the internal combustion engine, beyond 2035. But there was a stipulation that, instead of having 100% emissions reductions from vehicles, it would be 90%, and then this 10% would need to be filled from elsewhere, and allocated 3% for biofuels as well as e-fuels. And then under a proposal, it says the biofuels need to be advanced. So again, it remains to be seen whether they will stay advanced or it will be open for crop-based, whether they will increase the allocation for biofuels beyond 3%. But it's still a good signal that, the internal combustion engine won't be phased out. So there's still a possibility for it because there are also countries that are slower when it comes to electrification. For example, some Eastern European countries that are slower when it comes to electrification.
Exactly, it is. Okay, many thanks. And we do have one more question. I believe you already tackled those questions, but how removal of double cutting incentives impacting the German market as very important market in the EU?
Yeah, so it seems like the German market, instead of previously it would supply outside of Germany as well, but now German suppliers are very much focused on Germany because the volume obviously has increased volume of demand, so that could have some kind of implications on supplies elsewhere. Again, further tightening supplies.
Okay, thank you very much.
And sorry, I just wanted to add that, Germany also under the recommendations might be raising the GHG reduction target up to 17.4% as of 2027. So there will be a lot of demand for high GHG savings in Germany, basically.
Yes, I agree absolutely. So many thanks. So we succeed to answer all those questions, and I would, Suzanna, many thanks for your just outstanding, excellent presentation. Many thanks for S&P Global Energy Plus to being with us today. It was, I'm sure, very useful for biofuel market and for guys maybe thinking to go with those kind of the industry. So I would like to thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next session. Until that, have a great day and a great weekend as well. Many thanks.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.